and this is the last chapter I'm reading. December 1. December arrived at her uncle's home. The lobby smelled like roses, and lush vegetation filled the room. He lived on the top floor of the famed Laurel Tower. Its tree-like architecture started a growing movement of elven designs throughout the city. She never felt entirely comfortable in the place. Wealth didn't bother her, but the way her uncle used it to justify himself and his superior status to others did. He barely ever glanced at anyone he felt to be beneath him. Thankfully, aside from that, he was a remarkable person. His knowledge of history rivaled Elwarapedia, and his ability to work enchantments made him the talk of every magically versed circle. Above all, he'd always been kind to her when her parents hadn't. December rode the elevator up to his penthouse apartment. The doors opened to reveal Terwin's museum-like home. She walked toward his office. She knew she'd find him working there, but she couldn't pass through the central room without lingering to survey the continually expanding collection of artifacts. Each item stood inside a piece of glass that magically warped to form a tube. Lights projected from the floor, showcasing the objects and making them stand out against the black tile beneath. Her uncle cast all sorts of spells to ensure the item's protection from every conceivable effect that could damage them. There were intricately crafted jewels hanging on ornamental necklaces next to finely woven shirts and pants. Swords, shields, axes, tools, maps, and more hung in the other surrounding display cases. December spent at least some time looking at every object on one occasion or another. A glint of reflecting sunlight drew her eyes to a new artifact in the room. Hung among the various precious objects were 3 new swords. Each looked relatively simple, without much ornamentation, except for a symbol that adorned the sword's pommel. A flame had been etched into the one closest to her. There was something familiar about the swords. She moved to inspect them in more detail when her eyes picked up a faint sound from behind her. "Admiring my newest addition?" asked her uncle. She turned around and was surprised to find him almost directly behind her. She hadn't even heard him approach. Elves moved gracefully, but it shocked her not to hear any sounds of his movement. He dressed immaculately in a forest green suit. His snow-white hair gave the only sign of his age. What's the story behind them?" She knew he'd have a tale connected with the objects. He remembered one for everything in his home. His anecdotes were where she'd learned most of her history. A smile sprang to his face. "It is a rather long story, and I'm sure you have more important things to attend." He walked from the main room back into the dining room, and December followed. There were no showcase items in this place, and a single table sat snugly under a large window. Terwin led December to this spot and gestured to a chair. It slid backward in response. Her uncle enchanted almost everything in his apartment to make life a little easier for himself. She sat down in the chair. On the table sat a cup of freshly brewed tea. She hunched forward, expecting the delightful smell of blueberry to fill her nose. Instead, she only got hints of the stale air. Terwin leaned forward eagerly. "Unable to smell anything?" His black tie bunched up as he sat, but it straightened itself out without an effort from him. Another enchanted item. "You've put a spell on it, haven't you?" asked December. "Not on it," said Terwin. "I didn't feel anything. How is that possible?" "I'm tinkering with a spell that dampens intruders' senses." "You know I'm not an intruder," said December. "The spell doesn't lift until I've said, 'Welcome.'" The fresh aroma of blueberries wafted into her nose, and she heard a bird's wings flapping past outside. Terwin smiled at his niece's relief at having all her senses returned to her. She sipped her tea in excitement. "Thank you for having my favorite tea and restoring my sense of smell to enjoy it," she said sarcastically. "Of course, but if the spell worked as intended, you would have been deaf, blind, and without olfactory abilities." Her uncle put his hand on his chin and looked outside, obviously considering how to correct his spell. After another sip of tea, December sought to break the growing silence. Terwin was always thinking intently, and it didn't lend itself to conversations. "Why did you want me to visit today, Uncle?" Terwin left his thoughts and returned to the conversation. Looking back at her and away from the window, "I wanted to renew my urgings that you start working at my company." December suspected he might bring up the subject. "It's not dignified for an elf of your skill and ability to be working at a..." He paused. "Quick stop. I like my job. It gives me a ton of free time to perfect my painting and pays for my apartment." He'd wanted her to work in his company for as long as it existed. She knew he loved the idea of a family dynasty. It sounded great in theory, but her independence would be gone if she took a position with him. One summer, she interned under him, and she saw a side of Terwin she didn't like. The strong-willed business leader who dedicated himself solely to ambition. She didn't wish to see her uncle in that capacity again. "You make pennies for pay and live in a tiny apartment," said Terwin. It was clear to December that her uncle didn't comprehend that she enjoyed the life she led. "You could live in an apartment as big as this, 1 floor below me," continued Terwin. The idea of her uncle living above her when she brought home lovers seemed about as appealing as being under his sensory deprivation spell again. She smiled to try to keep the conversation amicable, but she knew he remained displeased by the scowl on his face. "I'm sorry, Uncle. Maybe one day, but for now I'm fine where I am. To think of you dealing with all those humans and dwarfs all day does my heart pain. The humans are unscrupulous. The dwarfs are criminals. I don't want to see anything happen to you." Terwin's feelings on other races had been clear to her since a very young age. She chalked it up to his ignorance of never having to interact with any of them at any length. In her opinion, the only real difference between the races was their physical appearance. Elves, humans, and dwarfs all just wanted to try and live peaceful lives with their families. You should try to spend some time with them. Don't lecture me. You weren't alive when the races first met or when we went to war with each other. You didn't see the dwarfs burning our forests out of spite with human mercenaries in the tow by the hundreds, spat Terwin. Trisembra worried that if the conversation continued, it would lead to a real fissure in their relationship. She changed the subject, hoping her uncle wouldn't linger on it. "Why don't you tell me something about those new swords?" He looked frustrated at her for a long moment before letting out a sigh. "They won't matter unless I find the last one." Terwin's outward anger vanished, but he obviously still ruminated on their disagreement. "You can go." Trisembra finished her tea in a large gulp and stood up from the table. "I'm sorry I angered you, Uncle." "I'm not angry, just disappointed," said her uncle. She paused to regard the new swords one more time before going. They all looked so very similar, except for the pommels. Aside from the flame etching, one showed a water drop on it and another seemed to display a gust of wind. "I just realized why these swords look so familiar. My friend, Heath, has one just like them in his living room," said Trisembra. She turned to see her uncle's gaze fixed on her. "What image is displayed on the pommel?" asked Terwin. "A lightning bolt." Terwin smiled. "Can you give me his address?" That's what I got.